Welcome to our discussion of what I call the conservative revival, which is 1977 to 1992. And this lecture is divided in two halves. Now, as we've seen, many Americans lost self-confidence in the 1970s, and there were a number of reasons why. One was the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War had seemed for most Americans to just drag on and drag on. And then finally, when the United States withdrew, it was viewed as a defeat for the United States, and many people talked openly about the many brave American soldiers who had been killed or wounded. Of course, then you had the Watergate scandal, in which President Richard Nixon was really forced to resign. If he hadn't resigned, it was clear he would have been impeached by the House of Representatives and almost certainly convicted in the Senate because his own party, the Republican Party, had turned against him. And then you had, immediately before the Watergate scandal, as I mentioned, Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, was forced to resign to face charges of bribery and corruption while he had been a governor. I haven't talked about this, but looking at the economy, there was a major increase in oil prices because the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, had greatly reduced production, and that had the obvious effect of, as you've learned in basic economics, supply and demand. When you reduce the supply, and there was essentially the same demand for oil and gasoline. Gasoline prices in the pump in the US and around the world went up significantly. And there were even shortages for many weeks. And I can remember seeing lines stretching 5 or 6 blocks. People would turn off their engines to save gasoline. And then when a car moved up to the pump, the other drivers would get out and push their cars so they didn't have to use gasoline to start the engine. There was high inflation. The interest rate to purchase a home went up to 17 or 18% in most parts of the country. And same thing, interest if you wanted not just to buy a home, if you had credit cards, you wanted to buy anything on interest, which Americans were accustomed to do since the 1920s. The interest rates increased significantly. And then on the culture side or society, we've already seen the highly visible hippies. Certainly not all the young people were hippies by any stretch of the imagination, but they were very visible. They were played up in the media, particularly television. There were always interesting stories. The whole counterculture movement of rejecting traditional values, that alienated the majority of Americans. And there were other reasons also, but these were the major reasons. Americans just had lost self-confidence in the direction of their country by the mid-1970s. Well, now we come to the 1976 election, and this was an important election because you have the Democratic candidate is Jimmy Carter. He won the election, as we'll see in a minute, and he portrayed himself very much as the common man who was pure and honest, and his pledge was to restore honesty to the presidency. This is just a few years after Nixon resigned, and the presidency, of course, then went to Gerald Ford, the vice president, who was very much an interim president because he hadn't been elected to either vice president or president. And Jimmy Carter was considered at the time a very modern Southern Democrat. He was from the state of Georgia. He really wanted to limit big government spending, and this put him in opposition to the traditional Democrats in the northern cities, who often advocated increased federal government spending. So he portrayed himself very much as a modern Southern Democrat. And as we'll see when we get to the 1992 election, this was exactly the same for Bill Clinton, who was a governor of the state of Arkansas. But Carter was not an inspiring leader. He was a real micromanager. He had no real vision for Americans. People, would vote for him saying, well, the Republicans screwed it up with Watergate, and, Vice President Agnew was corrupt, and President Ford's not exactly inspiring. So many people sort of wanted normalcy, and they thought, well, Jimmy Carter seems to be, and I think by all intentions, most people agree, he was a good, honest person, but he was not inspiring, and as we'll see over the next few minutes, he was generally considered to be a very weak leader. He was a real micromanager. I don't know if it's true, but the rumor was that he personally approved the schedule every morning as to who could play on the White House tennis courts, which were available, obviously, for only White House staffers. That may or may not be a true story, but it was widely circulated, and people said, well, that is sort of the person Jimmy Carter is. Very well-meaning. He often spoke of his devout Christianity. He was a very devout Christian. He spent his Sundays teaching Sunday school in Georgia at his local church. And what really hurt him also was he had poor relations with his own party in Congress. So the Democrats in Congress did not trust him. The more traditional Democrats from the northern states did not trust him and disliked him. And so he was very ineffective in advancing any sort of legislative program through Congress. Excuse me. He really mismanaged the economic recovery, according to most economists. There was high inflation, low growth, and instead of looking for means to reactivate the economy, he went the other way and said he delivered what most people considered like sermons in church. He was telling the American people what to do, and he blamed the, quote, self-indulgence of Americans. He said Americans had come to be too materialistic. They wanted to buy too many things, and Americans just had to get along with less. And I put here in blue one of the famous quotes he said, Americans needed to, quote, start getting along with less to accept a decline in our standard of living. Can you imagine the reaction to hearing that from the President of the United States? People would just most people shrug their shoulders and say, well, he's a nice guy and he's probably honest, but, we don't want to have our standard of living decline. And in foreign policy, which was where most Americans perceived as real weakness, the centerpiece of foreign policy now became promotion of human rights around the world. And this was sort of idealism versus Richard Nixon's geopolitical realism. And Henry Kissinger, I'm sure you've heard of. He was the national security advisor under President Nixon, and he also became Secretary of State. And for many years after that, he was a Harvard professor of political science. He's always served as advisors. So geopolitical realism was sort of saying, well, let's be realistic. Yes, we the United States, support governments that abuse human rights, and they don't have free elections. They're military dictators, but they're fighting the communists. Therefore, they're on our side. And there was sort of token, under Nixon and others, there was token recognition of human rights, but basically that was put in second place. So now human rights has advanced to the top of the agenda in foreign policy. And by July 1979, Carter was the most negative in polls of any president, including Richard Nixon was even higher polls. Now here we have, after being inaugurated at the Capitol building in January 1977, Carter took the amazing step to walk from the Capitol building to the White House. Of course, that produced panic in the Secret Service. And he said, no one has any reason to shoot me. So Secret Service just said, yes, sir. And they, of course, went around him. And what he wanted to symbolize was he was one of the people. He was a simple person. And this photo, you may not quite understand. A cardigan sweater is a kind of sweater that President Carter is wearing here. It's a sweater with buttons down. Now, this created somewhat of shock in the U.S. Now, let's go back. This is the 1970s. People expected the President of the United States went on television giving a speech to the American people or talking to the American people. They were obviously all men then. They expected them to wear a proper suit. So here he has a nice shirt on and a tie, but he doesn't have a suit coat. He has a sweater, and he's trying to be informal, talking to the American people. This really sent shockwaves through much of the American community, saying this is not what we want our president to dress like. This is far too informal. Now, to appreciate that, you have to get back in your time machine and pretend you're back in the 1970s. Now you'd probably think, well, big deal, it's no problem. But back then, this was not considered proper attire for a president speaking from the White House. Carter was a peanut farmer. He had a large peanut farm, and this is a photo of him and his wife out checking the peanut crops. This photo was taken during the presidential campaign. He's not president yet, and the Democratic Party rented Southwest Airlines aircraft to take him around, and you can see the name on it, Peanut One. So they, of course, the president's airplane is called Air Force One. Just to give you a sense of the times, this was a button. I don't think people really wear political buttons much anymore. I haven't seen them much. But back then, people would wear these and of course, have bumper stickers on their cars, too. And so this is Jimmy Carter. He was known for his big smile. And it says, "I don't want to be a peanut man. Make me President Carter." And this is at the presidential library. Every president, once they leave office, has a presidential library with many of their official documents and displays. The one for Lyndon Johnson is in Austin, and both of the President Bushes have libraries in Texas. One is near Texas A&M University, College Station, and the other one is in near Dallas. Well, this is at the entrance of the President Clinton's official presidential library in Georgia, and this is at the entrance. It's a peanut, obviously, with his big teeth, and to the left of it is one of the classic photos of Jimmy Carter, always with a big grin. So I think safe to say most Americans thought he was an honest person, which was great after having gone through Richard Nixon, but felt that he was very, very weak, and that people didn't like him giving sermons to the American people. But it was really the major foreign policy setbacks during this period that convinced Americans that Carter was weak and the country needed a strong leader. And of course, we'll see as we move along in this lecture, that led to Carter's defeat for re-election in 1980 and the election of Ronald Reagan from California. So the first major foreign policy setback for Carter was the Iranian hostage crisis. You may or may not know much about this. This occurred in November 1979. when the large American embassy in Tehran, the capital of Iran, was taken over by essentially the Iranian government. Thousands and thousands of so-called students were outside, people demonstrating, burning American flags. That happens all the time at American embassies. And the custom around the world, actually the requirement under international law, is that the host government protect diplomatic missions. And in this case, it was the responsibility under international conventions for the Iranian government to make sure that these protesters did not go over the walls and, destroy the embassy or attack the diplomatic personnel working there. That is the centuries-long practice. That practice predates the establishment of the United States. It goes back to the Middle Ages because diplomats are sent as envoys of their government, and they are entitled to complete protection with diplomatic immunity. For instance, my over 30 years in the State Department, I had a U.S. diplomatic passport. It's a black passport. And, I could not be arrested in a country. I had in another country, the U.S., of course I could, another country where I was on official business. And so it's a long, long tradition going back because the idea is diplomats as envoys or representatives of governments will talk to each other. And I might note, for instance, in Washington, D.C., there's sometimes very violent demonstrations outside certain embassies. In recent years, been many outside of the Turkish embassy, and people have had tried to attack the embassy. And the United States federal law enforcement officials are there, and they will arrest people trying to do that because it's the U.S.'s obligation to protect that embassy. And just another example would be when in December 1941, when, of course, Japanese military forces attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The United States then declared war on Japan and obviously broke diplomatic relations. The Japanese embassy in Washington and Japanese consulates around the United States, their diplomats were not taken hostage. They weren't put in prison. They were escorted to very nice luxury hotels where they were fed well. They were just told not to leave, and they had to wait a few days or a few weeks to find a way to get them back to Japan because there was a war between the two countries. So they were eventually given to the Swiss government, which was neutral in World War II, which got them back to Japan. And the same thing happened in Europe. So this was really, really unprecedented, what happened in Iran. I can't emphasize that enough. I won't go into the great background of this. It had to do with the Shah of Iran, who was a brutal dictator. And he had been overthrown earlier in the year, had left, and he was in Europe, and then he wanted to go to the United States for medical treatment. And the United States, because he had severe cancer, the United States allowed him in. And that was sort of the flashpoint. But anyway, I had just joined the State Department. I was in graduate school, had just gone through all my basic training. And when this happened, and so I knew someone who was an expert on the Middle East, and they invited me. It was very fortunate as a junior officer, sort of like the equivalent of a lieutenant in the military, to join the very small task force in Washington, which was dealing with the Iranian crisis. So that was like my first job. And I must emphasize how the taking of an embassy and then holding its diplomats hostage violated international standards of diplomatic practice. And the Iranian government itself was responsible. They weren't a group of students, because the Iranian troops outside, who in the past had prevented people from going over the walls and the gates of the embassy, just stood back and let them go through. And the protesters arrived with acetylene torches and devices to cut through the bars on the windows. So this is a photo soon after the embassy was taken. This is the State Department Operations Center in Washington. This is right next door to Secretary of State's office. And you can see right there in the red box, the distinguished looking young man. That's me. I'm on the phone, and you'll notice my hair was pretty long. It was over my ears because back then that was not considered being a hippie. That was sort of standard. The gentleman at the table with glasses, sort of facing us, reading a paper, that was the Secretary of State at the time, Cyrus Vance. So this was a small group. We staffed it in shifts 24/7. And this photograph was taken for a newspaper, so we had to cover up all the secret information. And the gentleman you see in the back there, and women in the back behind the glass, didn't want to be in the photograph because they were from the Central Intelligence Agency or CIA. So they didn't want to, have their faces in the newspaper. And you can see the various clocks up there with the time in Washington and some major world capitals around the world. So this was I was fortunate. This was very exciting, my first job, So this is sort of the situation outside the embassy. Here we have a protester burning the American flag. This happens all the time in American embassies around the world. And it's just to show, obviously disagreement with some aspect of U.S. foreign policy. And people often do it also because it makes the news. Now, on that fateful day in November 1979, here we have the protesters going over one of the gates of the embassy. The embassy was a large compound with several buildings in it, and the Iranian military and police who were guarding the compound, which is their requirement under international law, just stood by and let them go over. Well, I won't get into all the fascinating details. I could talk to you for hours about what happened, but they came in, they had blowtorches and all. They were able to cut through the bars and the windows. The Americans tried to destroy as much secret confidential information as possible, and the U.S. ambassador gave orders to the U.S. Marines inside the embassy to put down their weapons and not to fire shots at the people coming in. And I think it was a good decision because there were so many thousands of people coming in that, yes, you could have killed some, but then they would have probably killed everyone in the building. So the Marines said, yes, sir, and laid their weapons on the ground and put their hands up in the air. These are photos here that were all over world media. These are the staff in the embassy who were, most of them, blindfolded and paraded around, and they were all called spies. Here, the people stayed over a year in the embassy. People working for the State Department, Department of Defense, representatives of the U.S. government, and they weren't blindfolded and tied up the whole time. This was the first few days, and then they were kind of sorted out. And this is the cover of Time magazine. You've seen repeatedly Time magazine. It was sort of the standard news magazine in the United States. Almost everybody subscribed to it. Most of my students are in their 20s, so I suggest they talk to their parents. And, it was a very, very influential magazine. And here you see it blackmailing the USA. America is the great Satan, and the Ayatollah Khomeini was the religious cleric who was the leader of Iran at the time. I can't emphasize how this became a national issue. I can't think of any similar issue in the United States, with the exception of 9/11 attacks. This was similar to 9/11 on the impact of Americans. This is a photo I found on the interstate. Virtually every home in the United States, people tied a yellow ribbon on a tree or a mailbox. They put yellow ribbons on their cars. Here we see them on trees. And that was to symbolize solidarity with American hostages in Iran. Every day on the news would start off saying, this screenshot is, this is day 100 of our hostages in Iran. The entire nation was galvanized to do something. And this is what hurt Carter politically, because, as we'll see in a minute, he really failed in this respect. There were obviously some people who had ill feelings about all Iranians, as this gentleman holds up a sign. But in general, there was very, very little and isolated sort of anti-Muslim attitude in the United States. It was more about the government of Iran. There was some. Now, there were two very significant events that occurred. One was when the people came into the so-called students, they weren't really students, but when they came in, the terrorists came in to take over the embassy, there were 6 American diplomats, not in the main building called the Chancery, in an adjacent building, and they were doing visa work, for Iranians who wanted a visa to come to the United States for business or tourism or whatever. And they heard on their walkie-talkie radios what was happening, and they didn't really know what to do. And so one of them said, well, let's run out the side door and run to the British embassy. And, we know some friends in the British embassy, and take refuge there. So there was sort of chaos in the main embassy. Nobody really expected this to happen. And so these 6 Americans were never taken hostage. They ran out a side door and went through the streets, and there were crowds there chanting, "Kill Americans, kill the Americans," and whatnot. They went to the British embassy, and the British embassy said, "No, we can't take you. Sorry, we expect to be taken over in a few minutes ourselves." They weren't, but so then they ran. They knew some people who worked at the Canadian embassy. They went to their apartment. And so for several weeks, they were hidden inside the Canadian ambassador's home and some other Canadian officials. And then the United States mounted a very top secret CIA operation to get these 6 American diplomats out of Iran. How did they do that? Well, what they did was they sent in a CIA officer who gave them false Canadian passports. They were actually actual genuine Canadian passports. The Canadian government agreed in secret to issue legitimate passports to these 6 people so they could leave. And then they pretended that they were in Iran to make a movie. The movie was supposed to be called Argo. It was a science fiction movie, and they were part of the film crew who had arrived to kind of scout out locations and whatnot. And then they made reservations to leave on a flight. The one CIA agent who was in the movie, talk about the movie in a minute. The one CIA agent who had gone in to bring them out went with them, pretended he was a Canadian film producer. They went to the airport and got on a plane. It was rather tense. And they left the airport, and that was supposed to be secret information. They the U.S. government did not want, and I was involved in this on the Washington side, did not want to let the Iranians know that these people had escaped, because that would be a humiliation for the Iranian government. And the fear was that they could kill or torture the remaining hostages. But of course, the parents were told they weren't taken. These 6 people were taken to the American embassy in Switzerland, where they were hidden in the ambassador's home. And President Clinton decided to call the parents of these 6 people. Most of them were fairly young, in their 20s, just to let them know they were safe and they were all right, and asked them to promise not to talk to the media. Well, the 6 parents were informed, and one of the mothers immediately called up one of the major television stations and said, "Oh, I have a story to tell you." And news went out, and fortunately, there was no retaliation against our diplomats. Well, as you can see, it's a very exciting story, and a movie was made about this. The movie is called Argo, and by Ben Affleck. It's very, very close to reality of what happened. It actually won the Academy Award as the best movie of 2013. And it's about 99% accurate account of what happened. If anyone sees the movie and you want to know the Hollywood deviations, I'd be pleased to let you know. There are no major, a few things Hollywood did to create tension and have a better story. But it's essentially what happened. And I encourage you to watch the movie. It really will give you a good sense of the time. And again, I think it's on Netflix or Amazon Prime or whatever. But it's a really good movie, and it gets you back into one of the major foreign policy issues of the last 50 years for the United States. So the movie only really deals with the takeover of the embassy and then these 6 people leaving. And it mentions, but doesn't go into detail, what I'm going to tell you now. Well, 4 months later, 4 months after 6 of our diplomats are rescued, the United States launches a very secret mission. And this was a number of helicopters were flying into Iran. They were going to go to Tehran. And these were military helicopters. And, they were going to shoot their way in and bring out the hostages. At the same time, there was a very complex on-the-ground operation. The CIA had infiltrated a number of clandestine agents into Iran, and they were going to take some action on the ground that was supportive. And I might add also, because I was involved in this also on the planning side, I was in Washington. The United States had great cooperation from European allies whose diplomats in Iran were also assisting. Well, what happened? The Americans were so frustrated at this point. What can we do? What can we do? Everybody said the military should go in. Well, the military launched this raid, which was a total disaster. It never even got to Tehran. What happened is the helicopters took off. They landed in Iran, in the desert, and they needed to refuel the helicopters. And they had a plane there, that American Air Force plane, that landed in the desert to refuel the helicopters. And then as one of the helicopters was taking off, the pilot made an error, and the big blade of the helicopter hit the plane full of gasoline. And there was a major explosion. A number of Americans died, and they also had destroyed some of the helicopters. So at that point, it was impossible to continue with the mission because they didn't have enough helicopters to execute the mission. And then President Carter went on television the next day early the next day to report what had happened and said he bore all responsibility. And this was, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, a moment of sort of national humiliation for the United States. Here's the United States with by far the most powerful military in the world, lots of nuclear weapons, which obviously are useless in a situation like this. Nuclear submarines are useless, and the helicopters can't even get into Tehran for this rescue mission. I mean, who knows if it would have succeeded? It was very, very, there were people waiting in Tehran to assist on the ground, but it was called off. And then some of the bodies of the Americans were left at the scene. The Iranians went to the crash site, and they had badly burned bodies of American soldiers. And those bodies were taken to Tehran and hung up in the streets so people could scream death to the United States. And of course, that infuriated virtually everyone in the United States to see our dead servicemen hung up like piñatas and people throwing things at them. They were dead, but screaming at them. So this was a moment of, I can't tell you how much national humiliation in the United States. Well, the failed rescue attempt was blamed entirely on Carter. Rightly or wrongly, people said, well, Carter had micromanaged this. He should have had more helicopters. I don't think Carter himself had micromanaged the details of it. But anyway, he's the commander-in-chief. The President of the United States is in charge of the military. He had authorized the raid, and he took responsibility. And I put in red, and this is really true, at this point, Carter's ability to lead the country on anything was paralyzed. He was just viewed as sort of a nice Sunday school teacher who would deliver lectures, and the U.S. was without a leader. Then anyway, Carter continued secret negotiations with the Iranians, and he wanted to get the hostages released. It was clear the military option was not working. And when the embassy was taken, all the Iranian bank deposits or assets in the United States were frozen by the U.S. government. In other words, the Iranian government could not get access to this money. And Iran was exporting oil. It was a big oil exporter, so it had a lot of money. And Carter agreed to release that money when the hostages were released. Well, a lot of people said that's like paying ransom to a kidnapper. And the hostages were actually released the same minute that Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as president on January 20th, 1981. At noon, he was taking the oath of the president, and then the Iranians announced the release of the hostages and released them to a third country. Okay, we'll go back into Carter's presidency. We're here late 1979, early 1980. Remember, in November 1980, there is a presidential election. Well, a few weeks after the embassy in Tehran is taken, lo and behold, a mob of people, encouraged by the radical Pakistani government, took over the American embassy in Islamabad. But they did more than just take it over. They actually burned it to the ground, and 2 Americans were killed when they took it over. I was very involved in this. Our task force that was working on Iran sent me next door, in the next room, where they set up an emergency task force for our embassy in Pakistan under attack. And we are actually talking on the telephone with our people in the embassy in Pakistan, in the capital city of Islamabad, and we could hear the bullets ringing out. And they were in a room, so-called safe haven, where they would be protected, but the smoke was coming in. And so most of them were able to get out and be rescued by a helicopter, but 2 were killed in the process. And just like in Iran, the Pakistani police and military just stood aside and let the mob take over the building. Well, needless to say, President Jimmy Carter was considered responsible for this, and he was perceived as very weak in his response. This is a photo of right after the attack by the mob with the authorization of the Pakistani government burning the large embassy in Islamabad, Pakistan. Over where the smoke is on the right is the embassy building. Well, things are going pretty bad now for the U.S. We've had 2 embassies attacked, 1 burned to the ground, people taken hostage. And then, about the same time, the Soviet Union invades the country of Afghanistan. Well, the U.S. response was to supply the Afghan, what they called the freedom fighters, with weapons, particularly not with soldiers, but with weapons and a few advisors, and particularly these surface-to-air missiles, which are very small. You can hold them. It's like a large bazooka. You can hold it, have it rest on your shoulder, and you can shoot a rocket up. And those turned out to be very, very effective against the Soviet helicopters. It's ironic and significant that one of the people that the United States worked with in this was none other than Osama bin Laden. If you haven't heard of him, you will shortly in the next lecture. He was the head of Al-Qaeda, and of course he was the one who planned the attack on the United States on 9/11. Well, in retaliation for the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the U.S. and a number of other countries refused to participate in the 1980 Olympics, which were going to be held in Moscow. The U.S. also suspended shipping wheat and other grains to the Soviets, delayed signing another nuclear weapons deal with the Soviets, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty number 2. But of most importance, perhaps, for our course is many people thought the Soviets did this, that they went into just took over another country because they perceived President Clinton as weak. They looked at his reaction in Pakistan. They looked at his reaction in Iran. He's generally just a weak guy. And so the Soviets thought they could just go in. Now we'll turn to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan had been governor of California for 2 terms, and he led the New Right. This was a new term of conservatives that he led. He was a Hollywood actor. He never made, any really famous movies, sort of B movies, but you can go on to YouTube and find some of his movies. They're, it's kind of fun to watch him as an actor. He actually was in some movies with some of the great Hollywood actresses. But because of his acting experience, he knew how to communicate, and he was a very skilled speaker, and he had many entertaining stories. He was very informal. And even his political opponents who hated his politics called him the, quote, great communicator. He could really get his message across. And he was relaxed, easygoing style. And there's a video in the module from YouTube, and I encourage you to watch the first few minutes of it. You may want to watch all of it. And these are clips of some of his informal jokes, his style. And I know whenever I took public speaking courses in my previous career, we often looked at his speaking style because he knew how to connect with the audience. And if anyone who's done public speaking knows, you just don't stand up and talk and read something. You have to connect with the audience, and he really, really was able to do that. So he's called the great communicator by people who supported him politically and those who hated him politically. Before becoming governor and while he was governor, he had commented on politics espousing or advocating conservative principles. He wanted to cut social welfare programs. He thought the key to winning the Cold War was to increase military spending. He wanted to restore states' rights. He thought that the balance between states and the federal government had moved too far towards Washington. Of course, as a conservative, he promised to appoint conservatives to the Supreme Court, which is understandable. I mean, a liberal president wants to appoint liberals to the Supreme Court. And then he also campaigned saying by getting the right judges on the Supreme Court, he would overturn the Supreme Court decisions on abortion, the 1973 Roe versus Wade decision, which allowed abortion the first 3 months of pregnancy. And also he wanted to have the Supreme Court, with his justices, overturn a 1960s decision which had prohibited prayer in public schools. So he made a big issue of this, and as we'll see, he was able to achieve neither of those goals. He really placed emphasis on reducing taxes and regulation of business. And here are a couple of his favorite phrases which show up in almost every speech. Get the government off our backs and release the energies of free enterprise. And the next one is perhaps his famous quote. He said it all the time. Government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. Now, of course, when he was speaking to his supporters, they'd all stand up and cheer. Ronald Reagan also believed that textbooks used in schools shouldn't teach Darwinian evolution, but rather the biblical story of creation found in the book of Genesis. He was certainly anti-feminist. He believed women should be obedient to their husbands and not be feminists. And he strongly opposed the Equal Rights Amendment. And we saw, I think it was the last lecture, that Congress passed an Equal Rights Amendment, which just said there will, a couple sentences said something to the effect that there will be equal treatment by gender, and he was opposed to that. And he was very fervent anti-communist, who said communism must be opposed because it's pagan, in other words, non-religious totalitarianism. There was also tremendous growth of the New Right. Proposals to reduce taxes became popular. And in the state of California, there was a very interesting proposition. You will recall we talked, when was it, back in the progressive era. Yeah, that's right, the progressive era. It seems like a long time ago in this course, about how the progressives wanted to give more power to the people. And one of those was that people could put issues as a referendum on an election ballot. So in other words, if you get enough signatures, you can put an issue to be decided by the voters. Well, the voters, and this is always used in California to this very day. So voters in California had a proposition, famously known as Proposition 13. And this was when Ronald Reagan was governor, 1978. And this limited the increase in property taxes, because what was happening in California is that people bought a home when they were young, and then it was in a nice area, Los Angeles or near a beach or something, and the home's value was increasing significantly, and therefore their property taxes were increasing significantly, because the property tax could be, let's say, 1% of the value of the home, and if the value of the home went from $100,000 to $500,000, the property taxes would go from $1,000 to $5,000, which would be a tremendous increase. And so it really limited those increases in property taxes significantly. And it went to the voters, and the voters said, yes, we agree with this. The New York Times said this popular tax revolt was, quote, a modern Boston Tea Party. The New Right was also bolstered strengthened by migration, especially by senior citizens to the Sun Belt states, such as Texas. And that shifted the balance of power because in Congress, of course, the number of representatives depends on the population of states. So states like Texas, Arizona, the whole Sun Belt, the South, increased in population and power in Congress. Meanwhile, the Northeast and the Midwest industrial states, it's like Ohio, Michigan, and Illinois, they lost population and they started in economic decline. And those states are called often the Rust Belt because they're often old factories that are rusting because they're not competitive. Another important aspect is the rise of the religious right, who had a faith-based political agenda. And this was really the strongest sort of grassroots movement of the late 20th century. This was sort of from the bottom up. And you had a coalition of Catholic conservatives and Protestant evangelicals. And they were often on the TV and radio stations. They started some of their own schools and universities, and these huge mega churches where they'd have televised broadcasts of particularly the Protestants. And much of it wasn't just religion, but they would talk about their political agenda. And this was referred to as the moral majority. And that phrase is important, and Reagan often used it. The moral majority represents the majority of the people. It's not these hippies or the radicals. And it's interesting that Ronald Reagan himself was not particularly religious. He had no strong affiliation, and very seldom did he ever go to church. But he certainly united himself with the so-called religious right. The 1980 election, Ronald Reagan was just superb in terms of his personality. And he really made many Americans believe again that the U.S. was a great country. And, what we've seen under Carter, he said, was a temporary setback. What happened with our embassies in Pakistan, Iran, the oil price increases and all. And a lot of people who looked at it said it was like he was so optimistic it was infectious. And his slogan was, "Make America Great Again." Let's go back before Jimmy Carter. America was a great country and we'll make it great again. Make America Great Again. Here is his campaign button. His supporters would wear. They'd have this on bumper stickers. Reagan in 80, let's make America great again. Well, you may have heard that phrase, make America great again. Here it is. They call the MAGA, M-A-G-A, Make America Great Again, red cap with, of course, was the theme of Donald Trump's win in 2016 and throughout his presidency. So he was picking up on Ronald Reagan's slogan. Well, in the 1980 election, there was a huge Reagan victory over Carter. Reagan had 489 electoral votes, and Carter had 49. The popular vote, which of course doesn't decide the election, but Reagan was 51%, Carter 41%. And what Reagan really did is he managed to get the support of the conservative white Southern Protestants, who had previously always, for decades, voted Democratic, as well as the blue-collar Northern Catholics. And they moved from Democrats to Republicans, and they became known as the Reagan Democrats. And this phrase is still used today. If you follow current politics and you read any analysis, people will often talk about the Reagan Democrats. They're Democrats who went for Reagan, and of course the Democratic Party very much has wanted them back. This is the electoral map of the election. There are two things to focus on. One are the red versus blue. Forget for the moment about the shades of red. And you see the blue is the Democrats. You see Carter won Minnesota, which was always sort of Democratic at this time. Georgia, well, he won Georgia because that was his home state, and a few other small states. Now, if you look at the shades of the colors, the dark blue represent the margin of victory, and the dark blue was either over 10 or 15%. And Carter did very well in his home state of Georgia and in the little state of Rhode Island. But if you look at the red, that's for Ronald Reagan, the Republicans, you see he won by more than 15 percentage points in many states, including California, which turned Democratic later, but many states. So he had pretty strong support. And Ronald Reagan was reelected in 1984, and his vice president, George H.W. Bush, won the presidency in 1988. And so you have 12 years of what's called the Reagan Revolution. It was a revolution. It wasn't really a revolution, but it was considered major changes in economic policy and major changes in foreign policy. And as I mentioned, the hostages were released from the embassy in Tehran during his inauguration. And after they got back to the U.S., and they were back in Washington a couple of weeks later, they had a major parade, and the hostages are in these buses, and that's going from the Capitol to the White House, and lots of people are out there waving American flags. They were like national heroes. This is one of Ronald Reagan's famous phrases: "We maintain the peace through our strength. Weakness only invites aggression." He was, and our last slide in this first half is he essentially believed in cutting taxes to the minimum necessary to maintain a minimum government, but he did want a huge increase in military spending. Well, what happens when you cut your income, the taxes, and you greatly increase your military expenditures? Well, you end up with huge government budget deficits is what occurred. He did not eliminate New Deal programs. He didn't move to eliminate Social Security or Medicare or anything like that. And under his presidency, the economy did improve somewhat. And many economists think part of that was the massive increase in military spending, because the military weapons are produced by private sector companies. And so Reagan's form of economics, which was his 12 years of presidency and then 4 years for his vice president, is known as Reaganomics, or supply-side economics, where the argument is you cut taxes, you reduce regulations, and you let the free enterprise system work its miracles. That is still hotly debated today, and if you haven't already, I encourage you to take some economics courses, and you can look at both sides of that argument. Okay, that's the end of the first half of this lecture, and we'll continue in part 2. Thank you.